A young man named Lucas takes a job as a caretaker at the mysterious Delacroix estate, hoping to start anew after the tragic loss of his parents. As he navigates the dark corridors of the old mansion, Lucas uncovers hidden secrets about the Delacroix family and his own unexpected connection to their troubled legacy. With danger lurking in the shadows, Lucas must unravel the mysteries of the past to protect his future and reclaim a legacy that has been shrouded in darkness for decades. Lucas, a 24-year-old young man, had felt that his life was adrift ever since the sudden death of his parents. With few options, he found himself forced to leave his small hometown village in search of work in the city. Fate led him to the old and imposing Delacroix mansion, situated in the hills, a structure that bore centuries of history and rumors of dark happenings. The place was surrounded by dense forests, and the people from the nearest village avoided it, fearing the stories that circulated about the reclusive owner, Mrs. Delacroix. Upon arriving at the mansion's gate, Lucas was greeted by Agnes, the housekeeper. She was an elderly woman with a severe gaze, who silently guided him through the long, dimly lit corridors of the mansion to Mrs. Delacroix's office. The atmosphere there was oppressive, with old furniture and heavy curtains that barely let the sunlight in. Lucas felt a shiver down his spine as he noticed the many portraits of Delacroix family members, all with somber expressions and eyes that seemed to follow him as he walked. Mrs. Delacroix was an elegant figure despite her advanced age. Her deep blue eyes stared at Lucas with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. She was a woman of few words, but she made it clear that she expected absolute obedience and discretion. She hired him as a caretaker, responsible for the upkeep of the property and, above all, for the security of the library, a room that, according to her, was the heart of the house. Eager for a fresh start, Lucas accepted the job without question. The first night at the mansion was a mixture of restlessness and curiosity. He could barely sleep as the noises of the old house, creaks in the walls, whispers coming from places he couldn't identify, kept his mind racing. The next day, Lucas began to explore the mansion. During his cleaning in the library, something peculiar caught his attention: a bookshelf with an unusually deep space. Feeling a curiosity he couldn't explain, he began to inspect the shelf until his fingers found a hidden mechanism. With a soft click, a secret compartment opened, revealing a small, aged leather diary and an antique pocket watch with the initials AD engraved on the golden surface. As he examined the watch, he was startled by a gasp. Mrs. Delacroix stood at the door, pale as a ghost. Her eyes were fixed on the watch, and for a moment, the silence in the room was palpable. "Where did you find this?" Her voice was a sharp whisper, almost pleading. Lucas tried to explain, but before he could finish, she staggered, holding onto the door to keep from falling. Agnes appeared almost immediately, helping the lady to leave, but not before Lucas noticed the tears silently streaming down Mrs. Delacroix's face. The watch, now secure in his hands, felt like it was burning with fire. Lucas knew he had uncovered something much deeper than he had imagined, something that perhaps was meant to remain hidden. The following morning, Lucas couldn't shake the image of Mrs. Delacroix's face as she stared at the pocket watch. Her reaction had been so intense, so filled with emotion, that he found it impossible to focus on his duties. What was it about the watch that had affected her so deeply? Determined to find answers, Lucas returned to the library. The diary he had discovered alongside the watch still lay where he had left it, its worn cover now appearing more mysterious than ever. With hesitant fingers, he opened it and began to read. The diary belonged to a man named Adrien Delacroix, a name that sent a shiver down Lucas's spine. Adrien was the only son of Mrs. Delacroix, who had vanished mysteriously decades ago. His disappearance had been the subject of much speculation in the surrounding villages, with some whispering that he had met a tragic end, while others believed he had simply run away, leaving behind the life of wealth and privilege that he had never wanted. As Lucas flipped through the pages, he quickly realized that this diary contained secrets long buried. Adrien wrote about his strained relationship with his mother, the pressure of upholding the Delacroix legacy, and a deep sense of loneliness that seemed to echo through every entry. The later pages revealed something even more unsettling. Adrian had discovered something within the estate, something that terrified him. His final entries were disjointed, frantic, mentioning a shadow that had begun to follow him, haunting his every step. Lucas felt a chill run down his spine. Could this shadow be linked to Adrian's disappearance? And why had the diary and the watch been hidden so carefully? It was clear that these items held great significance, but Lucas couldn't yet piece together how they connected to the Delacroix family's dark past. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. Lucas quickly closed the diary and turned to see Mrs. Delacroix standing in the doorway, her face pale but composed. She seemed calmer now, though her eyes still held a glimmer of the fear he had seen the day before. "That watch," she began, her voice steady but laced with sorrow, "belonged to my son, Adrian. He disappeared many years ago, and that was one of the few things left behind." Lucas hesitated before speaking. "I found it hidden in the library, along with this diary. It seems to be his." Mrs. Delacroix's eyes widened as she approached slowly, reaching out to take the diary from Lucas. She ran her fingers over the worn leather cover, as if the very texture of it could bring back memories of her lost son. "I thought this was lost forever," she murmured. "I haven't seen this since he vanished. There were rumors, about what happened to him, but no one ever knew the truth. Not even me." Lucas felt a pang of sympathy for the elderly woman. She seemed so small now, standing in the vastness of the library, clutching the last remnants of her son. But there was also something else, a sense that Mrs. Delacroix knew more than she was letting on. Why was it hidden? Lucas asked gently. Was there something in it that someone didn't want to be found? Mrs. Delacroix looked up at him, her expression guarded. "There are things in this house, in this family, that are better left undisturbed. The Delacroix name carries a weight, a history of secrets. Adrian, he was searching for something that was never meant to be uncovered." Her words hung in the air like a heavy fog, filling Lucas with a sense of foreboding. Whatever Adrian had been searching for, it had led to his disappearance. And now, Lucas had stumbled upon the very clues that might reveal the truth. But some truths, he realized, might be more dangerous than the lies they conceal. Lucas couldn't stop thinking about the diary and the pocket watch. The more he thought about it, the more he felt drawn into the mystery of Adrian Delacroix's disappearance. Despite Mrs. Delacroix's warning to leave the past undisturbed, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was meant to uncover the truth. There was something about the old estate, the creaking floors, the shadowy corridors, the way the air seemed to hold secrets in every corner, that made him believe that the story wasn't over yet. One afternoon, as Lucas was cleaning the grand foyer, a man arrived at the estate. He was tall, with a weathered face and a no-nonsense demeanor, and introduced himself as Detective Harrison. Lucas immediately noticed the tension between Mrs. Delacroix and the detective, a silent understanding that passed between them. It was clear that this was not the first time Harrison had visited the estate. After a brief conversation, Mrs. Delacroix asked Lucas to show the detective around the house, instructing him to give Harrison access to any room he wished to see. The detective moved through the estate with a practiced eye, his presence adding an extra layer of unease to the already foreboding atmosphere. As they passed through the library, Lucas hesitated, wondering if he should mention the diary. But before he could decide, Harrison's sharp gaze fell on the bookcase where Lucas had found the hidden compartment. He paused, as if sensing that something wasn't quite right. "You found something here, didn't you?" Harrison asked, his tone firm and expectant. Lucas felt a surge of anxiety, but nodded. "I found a diary and a pocket watch. They belonged to Adrian Delacroix." Harrison's expression darkened. "Show me." Reluctantly, Lucas retrieved the diary and the watch. Harrison examined them closely, his face a mask of concentration. When he spoke again, his voice was low and serious. "Do you know who you are, Lucas?" Harrison asked, his eyes boring into Lucas's with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. Lucas frowned, confused by the question. I'm just Lucas. My parents died when I was young, and I grew up in an orphanage nearby. Why do you ask? Harrison didn't immediately respond. Instead, he flipped through the pages of the diary, his expression growing more troubled with each passing moment. Finally, he closed the book and handed it back to Lucas. There's something you need to know, Lucas. Mrs. Delacroix asked me to look into your background. She believes you might be connected to her family in ways you can't even imagine. Lucas felt his heart skip a beat. What are you talking about? Harrison sighed, rubbing the back of his neck as if searching for the right words. The more I looked into your past, the more strange coincidences I found. The fact that you were abandoned as a baby near this estate, your resemblance to Adrian. It's all too much to ignore. I believe that you might be Mrs. Delacroix's grandson, the son of Adrian Delacroix. The room seemed to spin around Lucas. He had always known that his past was a mystery, but this? The idea that he might be part of the very family whose secrets he was uncovering was overwhelming. No, Lucas whispered, shaking his head. That's impossible. I would have known. Someone would have told me. Harrison's expression softened, and he placed a hand on Lucas's shoulder. Sometimes, the truth is buried so deep that it takes time for it to come to light. But Lucas, if you are indeed Adrian's son, then there are people out there who won't want you to inherit what's rightfully yours. You need to be careful. The Delacroix family's enemies are closer than you think. Lucas felt a cold chill run through him. The mysteries of the Delacroix estate were no longer just about the past. They were about his own life, his identity. And if Harrison was right, uncovering the truth could put him in serious danger. But as the detective left, one thing became clear to Lucas. He had to know the truth. Whatever it took, he had to find out who he really was and what had happened to Adrian Delacroix. Because now, it wasn't just about solving a mystery, it was about surviving it. The weight of the detective's words hung over Lucas like a storm cloud. Could it really be true? Could he be the grandson of Mrs. Delacroix, the missing heir to the Delacroix fortune? The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. The mystery he had stumbled into was no longer just an old family secret. It was his story, his life. Over the next few days, Mrs. Delacroix was unusually quiet, avoiding eye contact and retreating further into the shadows of her vast estate. The tension in the house was palpable, with even the normally stoic Agnes moving about with a nervous energy. Lucas knew he needed to confront Mrs. Delacroix, but he wasn't sure how to begin. How do you ask someone if they're your grandmother? One evening, just as the sun was setting, Lucas gathered his courage and knocked on Mrs. Delacroix's study door. She was sitting by the window, gazing out at the sprawling grounds, lost in thought. The soft orange light of the setting sun bathed the room in a warm glow, a stark contrast to the cold atmosphere that had settled in the house. Mrs. Delacroix, Lucas began, his voice trembling slightly, I need to talk to you about what Detective Harrison said. She didn't turn around immediately, but when she did, Lucas saw a mixture of fear and sadness in her eyes. She motioned for him to sit across from her, and for a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of the conversation ahead pressing down on both of them. I never wanted this, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. I never wanted to drag you into the darkness that has plagued this family. But I can't deny the truth any longer. Lucas leaned forward, his heart pounding. Please tell me, am I really Adrian's son? Mrs. Delacroix's hands trembled as she reached out to take his. Yes, Lucas, you are my grandson, Adrian. He had a child, a son, but he never told me. He was always so secretive, always trying to protect those he loved from the dangers that surrounded us. Lucas felt a rush of emotions, relief, confusion, anger. But why was I abandoned? Why didn't anyone come looking for me? Tears welled up in Mrs. Delacroix's eyes. Adrian disappeared before he could tell me everything. All I knew was that he was involved in something dangerous, something that he feared would bring harm to our family. When you were born, I believe he thought the only way to keep you safe was to hide you, to send you away from this place. But after he vanished, I had no idea where to begin looking for you." She paused, her grip tightening on Lucas's hands. "I searched for years, Lucas. I never gave up hope that I would find you, but it was as if you had vanished into thin air. And now, after all this time, you've come back to me, but under such terrible circumstances." Lucas sat back, trying to process everything he had just learned. The idea that his father had tried to protect him by sending him away, only to leave him in an orphanage, was hard to accept. But the pain in Mrs. Delacroix's eyes was undeniable. She had lost her son, and in a way, she had lost her grandson too. "Do you know what happened to him?" Lucas asked, his voice barely audible. "To Adrian?" Mrs. Delacroix shook her head, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "No, I don't. He was involved in something dangerous, something that had to do with our family's enemies. I believe they are the ones who took him from me, who kept him from ever coming back. And now, I fear they may come after you, too." Lucas felt a chill creep up his spine. The danger he was in was suddenly very real, very close. But before he could dwell on that, Mrs. Delacroix spoke again, her voice laced with determination. "We need to know for sure, Lucas. There's only one way to confirm what we both fear is true. A DNA test. It will tell us if you are truly my grandson." The thought of undergoing a DNA test was daunting, but Lucas knew it was the only way to uncover the truth. "I'll do it," he said firmly. "I need to know." Mrs. Delacroix nodded, a look of both hope and dread on her face. "Then we'll do it. I'll arrange for the test as soon as possible." In the days that followed, Lucas felt like he was living in a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. The test was conducted quickly, a simple swab of his cheek and Mrs. Delacroix's, and then they waited. Each passing hour felt like an eternity, the uncertainty gnawing at Lucas's nerves. Finally, the results arrived. Mrs. Delacroix and Lucas sat side by side in the study, the envelope containing the answer to everything trembling in her hands. With a deep breath, she opened it and began to read. Her face went pale, and she handed the paper to Lucas. His hands shook as he read the results. It was true. He was Adrian's son. He was the lost heir to the Delacroix fortune. But with that truth came a chilling realization. If his father had been taken by the family's enemies, then they would surely come for him next. Mrs. Delacroix looked at Lucas with a mixture of love and fear. "You are my grandson," she said softly, "and now, you must be prepared for what that means." Lucas nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. The Delacroix estate was his by blood, but it came with a legacy of danger and secrets that he was only beginning to uncover. As he sat in the study, holding the paper that confirmed his lineage, Lucas knew that his life had changed forever. The mystery of Adrian's disappearance was now his to solve, and the enemies of the Delacroix family were his to face. But Lucas also knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would not be taken as easily as his father had been. The revelation of Lucas's true identity sent shockwaves through the Delacroix estate. Mrs. Delacroix, though relieved to have finally found her grandson, was gripped with fear over what this discovery might bring. The estate's dark past was not just a series of unfortunate events. It was a web of deceit and treachery, woven by those who sought to destroy the Delacroix family from within. Determined to protect Lucas, Mrs. Delacroix insisted on hiring additional security for the estate and doubled down on her efforts to uncover the truth behind Adrian's disappearance. She also made it clear that Lucas must be cautious in all his dealings, as the family's enemies could be lurking anywhere, waiting for the right moment to strike. Despite the heightened security, Lucas felt an increasing sense of unease. The once stately manor now felt like a gilded cage, and the shadows seemed to grow darker with each passing day. Agnes, the ever-watchful housekeeper, became even more vigilant, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Yet, there was an air of tension between her and Mrs. Delacroix that Lucas couldn't quite place. Something was being left unsaid. One afternoon, As Lucas was walking through the estate grounds, he noticed a figure standing near the edge of the forest that bordered the property. It was Detective Harrison. The detective had been a frequent visitor since the DNA results confirmed Lucas's identity, always under the pretense of ensuring his safety. But something about Harrison's presence felt off. There was a coldness in his demeanor that hadn't been there before. "Detective," Lucas called out as he approached, "is everything all right?" Harrison turned slowly, his face unreadable. "Lucas, we need to talk," he said, his voice devoid of its usual warmth. "There's something you need to know about your family's history, and about those who would see it come to an end." They walked together to a secluded part of the garden, away from prying eyes. Harrison's tone was grave as he began to speak. "The Delacroix family has always had enemies, Lucas. But the most dangerous ones are those who hide in plain sight. I've been looking into Adrian's disappearance, and I believe there's someone close to the family who played a part in it." Lucas felt his stomach churn. Who? Who would do something like that? Harrison looked him straight in the eye. "A close family friend. Someone who has had access to the estate for years, who knows its secrets. This person manipulated events to drive a wedge between Adrian and your grandmother, ultimately leading to Adrian's disappearance." The weight of Harrison's words pressed down on Lucas like a heavy stone. "Are you saying someone here, someone I've met, could be responsible for what happened to my father?" Harrison nodded grimly. "I'm afraid so. And if they were willing to go to such lengths to keep Adrian from inheriting the estate, they won't hesitate to do the same to you." A cold sweat broke out on Lucas's forehead. The idea that someone he might have trusted was, in fact, plotting against him was almost too much to bear. "Do you know who it is?" Harrison's expression hardened. "I have my suspicions, but I don't have solid proof yet. That's why you need to be careful, Lucas. Trust no one, not until we can be sure of who's on your side." Lucas's mind raced as he tried to piece together the fragments of information. There were only a handful of people who had access to the estate: Mrs. Delacroix, Agnes, and a few trusted staff members. Could it be one of them? Or was there someone else lurking in the shadows, someone he hadn't even considered? As if reading his thoughts, Harrison continued, "This person has been in the Delacroix family's orbit for a long time. They've cultivated trust, built relationships, all while hiding their true intentions. I believe they were the ones who orchestrated Adrian's kidnapping, and they may be planning to do the same to you." Lucas felt a surge of anger and determination. "Then we need to find out who it is and stop them. I won't let what happened to my father happen to me." Harrison placed a reassuring hand on Lucas's shoulder. "We will, but you need to stay vigilant. Watch everyone closely and don't let your guard down. Whoever this person is, they're dangerous and desperate. They won't stop until they get what they want." Lucas nodded, his resolve hardening. He would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. But as he turned to leave, Harrison called out to him one last time. "And Lucas, remember, this enemy isn't just hiding. They're watching. Every move you make, they'll know about it. Be careful who you trust." The warning echoed in Lucas's mind as he walked back to the estate. The realization that someone close to him could be a traitor filled him with dread. The once grand halls of the Delacroix Manor now felt like a labyrinth of deceit, with danger lurking behind every corner. As he entered the house, Lucas caught sight of Agnes at the far end of the corridor, her eyes briefly meeting his before she turned away. Something about her demeanor struck him as odd, but he pushed the thought aside. There were too many possibilities, too many shadows to chase. But one thing was certain: the hidden enemy was real, and they were closer than ever. Lucas knew he had to uncover their identity before it was too late, before the legacy he had only just discovered was ripped away from him, just as it had been from his father. Lucas couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind through the old estate seemed to carry with it the presence of a hidden enemy. The estate that once held the promise of a new beginning now felt more like a prison, and the weight of its secrets pressed down on him with an unbearable intensity. Determined to uncover the truth, Lucas began to scrutinize everyone around him. searching for any sign of betrayal. He spent hours in the library, poring over old documents, letters, and journals, hoping to find some clue that might reveal the identity of the traitor. But the more he searched, the more elusive the answers became. The Delacroix family's history was a tangled web of alliances, feuds, and buried secrets. It wasn't long before his behavior drew the attention of Agnes. One evening, as Lucas was returning from another fruitless search in the library, he found her waiting for him outside his room. Her expression was unreadable, her eyes sharp and piercing. "You've been spending a lot of time in the library, young master," Agnes said, her voice measured and controlled. "What exactly are you looking for?" Lucas hesitated, trying to gauge her intentions. Agnes had been with the Delacroix family for as long as anyone could remember, and her loyalty to Mrs. Delacroix was unquestionable. But Harrison's warning echoed in his mind. "Trust no one." "I'm trying to understand what happened to my father," Lucas replied, choosing his words carefully. "I want to know the truth about this family." Agnes's gaze remained steady, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something that Lucas couldn't quite place. "The past is full of pain and darkness, Lucas. Some things are better left buried. Or maybe some things need to be brought to light," Lucas countered, feeling a surge of defiance. "If I'm to inherit this estate, I need to know what I'm up against. I need to know who I can trust." Agnes's expression hardened, and for a moment, Lucas thought she might confront him. But then she simply nodded, her face betraying nothing. "Very well. But be careful, Lucas. Not all truths bring peace." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Lucas standing in the dimly lit corridor, more determined than ever to uncover the secrets of the Delacroix family. The following morning, Lucas decided it was time to confront Mrs. Delacroix. He found her in her study, surrounded by the remnants of the past. Portraits of long-dead relatives, books filled with the family's history, and the ever-present shadows that seemed to cling to the walls. "Grandmother," Lucas began, the words still feeling strange on his tongue. "We need to talk." Mrs. Delacroix looked up from her desk, her eyes filled with a sadness that seemed to have settled there long ago. "What is it, Lucas?" He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I've been speaking with Detective Harrison. He believes someone close to this family was responsible for my father's disappearance, and that they might be after me as well." A flicker of fear crossed Mrs. Delacroix's face, but she quickly masked it. "Harrison is a good man, but he sees enemies everywhere. You mustn't let his paranoia consume you." "It's not just paranoia," Lucas insisted, his voice firm. "There's something wrong here. I can feel it. And I think you know more than you're telling me." Mrs. Delacroix sighed, the weight of the years evident in her posture. "Lucas, the Delacroix family has always been surrounded by intrigue and betrayal. But not everyone who has served this family is an enemy." "Then tell me who I can trust," Lucas pressed. "Because right now, I don't know if I can trust anyone." Mrs. Delacroix looked away, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them together. "There are things I wish I could tell you, Lucas, but some truths are too dangerous. Your father, Adrian, he tried to protect you by keeping you away from all of this. I'm trying to do the same, but I'm already involved," Lucas argued. "There's no going back now. If you want to protect me, then help me. Help me find out who's behind all of this." For a long moment, Mrs. Delacroix remained silent, her gaze fixed on the floor. Then, with a heavy sigh, she reached into a drawer and pulled out a bundle of letters, tied together with a faded ribbon. She handed them to Lucas, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. "These letters were written by Adrian in the months before he disappeared," she said quietly. "I've never shown them to anyone. They contain his thoughts, his fears, and his suspicions." Lucas took the letters, his heart pounding. "Thank you," he whispered, overwhelmed by the significance of what she had just entrusted to him. Mrs. Delacroix nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Be careful, Lucas. The person who betrayed Adrian is still out there, and they will do whatever it takes to keep their secrets hidden." Later that night, Lucas sat alone in his room, the letters spread out before him. As he began to read, Adrian's voice seemed to come alive through the words on the page. The letters were filled with details of secret meetings, coded messages, and cryptic references to a close friend who had turned against him. Adrian had been onto something big, and it had cost him his life. The more Lucas read, the more the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. Adrian had suspected someone within the estate, someone with access to the inner workings of the Delacroix family. And the more Lucas thought about it, the more one name kept coming to mind: Agnes. Could it be? Could the trusted housekeeper, who had served the Delacroix family for decades, really be the one who betrayed them? The thought was almost unthinkable, but the evidence was mounting. The next morning, Lucas decided it was time to confront Agnes. He found her in the kitchen, preparing breakfast as if nothing were amiss. But when she saw the look on his face, she froze, her hands trembling ever so slightly. "Agnes," Lucas began, his voice cold, "we need to talk." Agnes turned to face him, her expression guarded. "What is it, Lucas?" "I know you were close to my father," Lucas said, watching her reaction carefully. "I know he trusted you, but I also know that he was betrayed by someone close to him, someone he never suspected." For a moment, Agnes said nothing, her face a mask of neutrality. Then, slowly, she set down the knife she was holding and turned to fully face Lucas. "What exactly are you accusing me of?" Lucas felt his heart pounding in his chest. "I'm not sure yet, but I found letters from my father. Letters where he talks about a close friend who turned against him. And you were one of the only people he trusted." Agnes's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, Lucas saw a flash of anger in her expression. "I served this family for more than 30 years. I was loyal to your father, and I've been loyal to your grandmother. But loyalty is a dangerous thing, Lucas. It can be twisted, manipulated, and used against you." "Then tell me the truth," Lucas demanded. "Did you betray him? Did you have something to do with his disappearance?" Agnes stared at him for a long moment, her face hardening into a mask of defiance. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, Lucas. This family is rotten to its core. Your father tried to save it, but he was too weak. And you're just like him. Weak, naive, and destined to fall." Before Lucas could react, Agnes lunged toward him, her hand reaching for the knife she had just set down. But Lucas was quicker, grabbing her wrist and forcing her back. They struggled for a moment, the kitchen filled with the sound of their scuffle, until Lucas managed to wrest the knife from her hand and pin her against the counter. "Tell me the truth," he demanded, his voice shaking with adrenaline. Agnes sneered at him, her eyes filled with hatred. "The truth? The truth is that this family doesn't deserve to survive. Adrian was a fool, and so are you. And if you think you can save the Delacroix name, you're more deluded than he ever was." Lucas felt a wave of despair wash over him. He had come so far, only to discover that the person he had trusted the most was the very one who had been working against him. But he couldn't give up now, not when he was so close to the truth. With a final effort, he forced Agnes to the ground, securing her hands with a kitchen towel. "You're going to tell me everything," he said, his voice cold and determined. "And then you're going to face justice for what you've done." Agnes laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Justice? There is no justice in this world, Lucas. Only power. And those who are willing to do whatever it takes to keep it." But as Lucas looked down at her, he knew that her reign of terror was over. The hidden enemy had been unmasked, and the truth, as painful as it was, had finally come to light. Now, all that was left was to pick up the pieces of the shattered Delacroix legacy and rebuild it, stronger and more resilient than before. And Lucas knew that with the truth on his side, he could do just that. The revelation of Agnes's betrayal sent shockwaves through the Delacroix estate. Lucas stood in the aftermath, surrounded by the remnants of the deception that had plagued his family for decades. Agnes, now subdued and awaiting the arrival of the authorities, sat silently in the kitchen, her eyes empty, as if the life had drained out of her the moment she was unmasked. Mrs. Delacroix was devastated. The woman she had trusted more than anyone else, the one who had been by her side through all the hardships, was the very person who had torn her family apart. As Lucas explained the details of Agnes's confession, the elderly matriarch's shoulders sagged under the weight of the betrayal. "I never suspected her," Mrs. Delacroix whispered, her voice trembling. "She was with us for so long, always so loyal. How could I have been so blind?" Lucas reached out, taking her hand gently. "It wasn't your fault. Agnes was clever, and she knew how to hide her true intentions. But now that we know the truth, we can start to rebuild, to reclaim the Delacroix legacy." Mrs. Delacroix looked at Lucas, a glimmer of hope returning to her eyes. "Yes, we can. But it won't be easy. The Delacroix name has been tarnished, our fortune nearly destroyed. We'll need to work together if we're going to restore what was lost." Lucas nodded, determination hardening his resolve. "I'm ready, grandmother. I'll do whatever it takes." The following days were a whirlwind of activity. With Agnes in custody, Lucas and Mrs. Delacroix began the arduous task of taking control of the estate. They combed through financial records, legal documents, and family archives, piecing together the fragments of what remained of the Delacroix empire. The damage Agnes had inflicted was extensive, but not irreparable. Lucas threw himself into the work, driven by a newfound sense of purpose. As he delved deeper into the estate's affairs, he uncovered hidden assets, old investments, and properties that had been forgotten or deliberately concealed. With each discovery, the Delacroix fortune slowly began to rebuild itself, and with it, Lucas's confidence in his ability to lead. Meanwhile, Mrs. Delacroix took on the task of restoring the family's reputation. She reached out to old acquaintances, former business partners, and distant relatives, carefully mending the relationships that had been damaged by years of isolation and mistrust. Her efforts bore fruit, and soon, the Delacroix name was once again spoken of with respect and admiration. But the greatest challenge still lay ahead. Reclaiming the Delacroix legacy meant not just rebuilding the estate, but also redefining what it stood for. Lucas and Mrs. Delacroix knew that the old ways, the secrecy, the power struggles, the obsession with wealth, had led their family down a dark path. If they were to move forward, they needed to create a new vision for the future. One evening, as they sat together in the grand parlor, Mrs. Delacroix broached the subject. "Lucas, the Delacroix family has always been known for its wealth and influence. But I don't want that to be our only legacy. We need to do more, to give back, to make a difference in the world." Lucas looked at her thoughtfully. "What do you have in mind?" Mrs. Delacroix smiled, a warmth returning to her expression that Lucas hadn't seen in a long time. "I want to turn the estate into something more than just a symbol of our family's history. I want it to be a place of learning, of culture, where people can come to connect with the past and be inspired for the future. And I want to establish a foundation in your father's name to support education and community projects." Lucas felt a swell of pride. "I think that's a wonderful idea. It's time we use our resources for something greater than ourselves." And so, with a shared vision, they set to work. The Delacroix estate, once shrouded in mystery and darkness, began to transform. The Grand Manor was open to the public as a historical landmark, its halls filled with exhibits detailing the family's history, the good and the bad. Visitors came from far and wide to see the estate, drawn by the story of a family that had risen from the ashes of betrayal to build something new. At the same time, Lucas and Mrs. Delacroix established the Adrian Delacroix Foundation, named in honor of Lucas's father. The foundation provided scholarships to underprivileged students, funded cultural and educational programs, and supported local charities. It became a beacon of hope and generosity, a testament to the strength and resilience of the Delacroix family. As the months passed, the Delacroix estate once again became a place of life and vibrancy. The gardens bloomed, the halls echoed with laughter and conversation, and the future seemed brighter than ever. Lucas, now fully embracing his role as the heir to the Delacroix legacy, felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had not only uncovered the truth of his family's past, but had also helped to shape its future. One afternoon, as Lucas stood on the balcony overlooking the estate, Mrs. Delacroix joined him. They stood in silence for a moment, taking in the view of the grounds, now bustling with activity and joy. "You've done well, Lucas," Mrs. Delacroix said softly. "Your father would be proud of you." Lucas smiled, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. "I think he'd be proud of both of us. We've turned something dark into something beautiful." Mrs. Delacroix nodded, her eyes misty with emotion. "Yes, we have. And now, it's time to look forward, to build on what we've started, and to ensure that the Delacroix name stands for something truly meaningful." Lucas looked out at the estate, the place that had once been the center of so much pain and now symbolized hope and renewal. He knew that the journey wasn't over, that there would be challenges ahead, but he also knew that he wasn't alone. Together, he and Mrs. Delacroix had reclaimed their legacy, and in doing so, had created a future that was brighter and more promising than either of them could have imagined. The Delacroix name would no longer be associated with secrets and betrayal, but with strength, resilience, and the power to change for the better. And that, Lucas realized, was a legacy worth fighting for. The transformation of the Delacroix estate into a place of learning, culture, and community marked the beginning of a new chapter for both Lucas and Mrs. Delacroix. The Grand Manor, once steeped in mystery and haunted by betrayal, now stood as a symbol of resilience and renewal. But while the estate had been restored, the real work was just beginning. Building a future that honored the past while forging a new path forward. As the estate continued to thrive, Lucas took on a more active role in the community, driven by a desire to make a tangible difference. He and Mrs. Delacroix established partnerships with local schools, museums, and charities, using the resources of the Adrian Delacroix Foundation to fund educational programs, cultural events, and scholarships for underprivileged youth. The foundation quickly became a cornerstone of the community, and Lucas found fulfillment in seeing the positive impact they were making. The estate itself became a hub of activity. The once quiet halls now buzzed with the energy of visitors, scholars, and artists who came to study, create, and learn. The Delacroix Library, where Lucas had first uncovered the family's secrets, was now open to the public, housing a vast collection of rare books and historical documents. It became a place where people could explore the history of the Delacroix family and, more broadly, the region's cultural heritage. One of the estate's most ambitious projects was the creation of a museum dedicated to the history of the Delacroix family, which included not only their triumphs but also their struggles. Lucas and Mrs. Delacroix believed that by sharing the full story, the good and the bad, they could inspire others to learn from the past and strive for a better future. The museum quickly became a popular attraction, drawing visitors from near and far who were fascinated by the tale of a family that had overcome so much adversity. But the most meaningful endeavor for Lucas was the scholarship program established in his father's name. The Adrian Delacroix Scholarship provided financial assistance to students from disadvantaged backgrounds, giving them the opportunity to pursue higher education and achieve their dreams. Each year, Lucas personally reviewed the applications, eager to support those who reminded him of his own journey. The scholarship recipients often visited the estate, sharing their stories and aspirations with Lucas and Mrs. Delacroix, who took great pride in watching them grow and succeed. As the years passed, the bond between Lucas and Mrs. Delacroix deepened. They were no longer just grandmother and grandson, but partners in building a legacy that would endure for generations. Together, they faced the challenges of running the estate and foundation, but they also celebrated their victories, large and small. The once distant Mrs. Delacroix became more open, her heart softened by Lucas's unwavering dedication and love. One afternoon, as they walked through the estate's flourishing gardens, Mrs. Delacroix turned to Lucas with a thoughtful expression. "You've done so much for this family, Lucas. You've brought us back from the brink, and you've given us a future to be proud of." Lucas smiled at her, feeling the warmth of her words. "We did it together, grandmother." I couldn't have done any of this without you. Mrs. Delacroix paused, looking out over the gardens where children from the local school were playing, their laughter filling the air. I've been thinking a lot about the future lately, about what comes next. Lucas looked at her curiously. What do you mean? Mrs. Delacroix sighed softly, a gentle smile on her face. I'm not getting any younger, Lucas. And while I've been blessed with a second chance to make things right, I know my time is limited. The estate, the foundation, it will all be yours one day. Lucas felt a pang of emotion at her words. He knew this day would come, but hearing it from her made it all the more real. You'll always be a part of this place, grandmother. Everything we've done together. Mrs. Delacroix reached out and took his hand, her grip firm despite her age. Promise me, Lucas, that you'll continue to build on what we've started, that you'll keep the Delacroix name strong and use it for good. Promise me that you'll live your life fully and with purpose, just as your father would have wanted. Lucas nodded, his throat tight with emotion. I promise, grandmother. I'll continue the work we've started, and I'll make sure the Delacroix legacy is one that we can both be proud of. Mrs. Delacroix smiled, her eyes shining with pride. I know you will, Lucas. You've already made me so proud. In the years that followed, Lucas continued to fulfill the promise he had made to his grandmother. Under his leadership, the Delacroix estate and foundation flourished, becoming a beacon of hope and inspiration for countless people. The estate hosted cultural festivals, educational workshops, and community events, drawing people together in celebration of art, history, and learning. Lucas also found time to focus on his personal life. The pressures of the past no longer weighed him down, and he began to open his heart to the possibility of love and family. He met someone special, someone who understood his journey and supported his vision for the future. Together, they built a life filled with love, joy, and purpose, welcoming their own children into a world shaped by the legacy of the Delacroix family. As the years passed, the Delacroix estate remained a symbol of resilience and renewal. The halls that had once echoed with secrets and sorrow were now filled with laughter, music, and the sounds of life. The Adrian Delacroix Foundation continued to grow, touching the lives of thousands and ensuring that the Delacroix name was remembered not for its wealth, but for its contributions to the world. One day, as Lucas stood on the balcony of the manor, now much older and with a family of his own, he looked out over the estate with a deep sense of satisfaction. The journey had been long and fraught with challenges, but it had also been one of discovery, growth, and redemption. As the sun set over the Delacroix estate, casting a golden glow over the gardens and the people who had gathered there, Lucas knew that the legacy he and his grandmother had built would endure for generations. The Delacroix name would forever be associated with strength, compassion, and the unwavering belief in the power of good. And as Lucas turned to join his family, he carried with him the knowledge that he had fulfilled his promise, not just to his grandmother, but to himself and to the Delacroix family. He had reclaimed their legacy, and in doing so, had created a future that was bright, hopeful, and filled with endless possibilities. The hidden legacy had been uncovered, and in its place, a new legacy had been born. One that would stand the test of time and inspire those who followed to continue building a world where love, justice, and truth prevailed.